Paul stood in the middle of the Sillery training arena rolling his shoulders. As he studied the space around him, the arena was massive, surrounded by towering walls and packed with spectators. Warriors stood in neat rows, their glowing eyes watching in silence above them. On a grand balcony, Queen Tevana and the High Council observed the event. Paul took a deep breath. He had been in difficult situations before, but this was different today. He was supposed to train the princess of an alien empire, except V didn't seem too eager to learn from him. The princess stood across from him, arms crossed, her expression a mix of boredom and annoyance. "This is pointless," she muttered. "I don't need a human to teach me anything." Paul sighed. He had dealt with stubborn students before, but Vieri was something else. "Look, I didn't come here to waste your time. If you already know everything, prove it." V narrowed her eyes. "Fine, we fight." Paul's eyebrows shot up. "Fight? I thought we were training." "This is training," she said with a smirk. "If you are to teach me, you must first show me your strength." A murmur spread through the watching warriors. They seemed excited about this. Haul on the other hand wasn't sure this was a good idea. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I mean, I'm human. I don't have claws, armor, or super strength." V stepped forward, raising her fists. "Then this will be over quickly." Paul sighed and loosened his stance. He had no choice now. If he refused, he would lose respect. If he lost too easily, she would never take him seriously. He had to prove that humans were more than just fragile beings. A loud chime rang through the arena. The fight had begun. Vuri moved faster than Paul expected. She closed the distance between them in an instant, throwing a powerful punch straight at his chest. Paul barely dodged, stepping to the side just in time. He felt the air shift as her fist passed him. If that had landed, it would have knocked him down for sure. She didn't slow down, spinning around. She kicked toward his ribs. Paul ducked, rolling away before she could hit him. The crowd murmured again, surprised that he had avoided her attacks. Vi frowned. "You run well, human, but you can't avoid me forever." Paul smiled. "I don't need to avoid you forever. I just need to think faster than you." Very charged again. But this time Paul was ready. Instead of dodging, he stepped forward at the last second, using her own momentum against her. He grabbed her wrist and untwisted, slightly forcing her off balance. She stumbled, her eyes widening in surprise. Paul quickly stepped back, keeping his hands up. "See, strength isn't everything. A fight isn't just about power, it's about control." Vi gritted her teeth and lunged again. Paul continued to dodge and counter, never meeting her attacks with direct force. He used his agility and quick thinking, staying just out of her reach. He wasn't winning through strength, he was winning through strategy. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. The Auxiliar were warriors, but they had never seen a fight like this. They were used to battles of brute force, not tactical movement. Even Queen Zion seemed intrigued. After several minutes, Veri stepped back, breathing heavily. She wasn't exhausted, but she was clearly frustrated. Paul smiled and lowered his hands. "You're fast and strong, but you rely too much on power. If I were another Gari, maybe that would work, but humans, we fight differently." Veri stared at him for a moment, then let it out a small chuckle. "You are not as weak as I thought." Paul smirked. "And you're not as unbeatable as you thought." The queen stood from her throne. "Enough. The lesson begins tomorrow." Paul nodded, feeling the sense of victory. He had survived his first challenge. Now the real training would begin. The grand palace of the Seri Empire stood tall, its golden spires reaching toward the twin suns. Paul stepped out of the transport pod, his boots clicking against the polished metal floor. He adjusted his uniform, feeling the weight of 100 alien eyes on him. He was the only human here, and it was clear that his presence was unusual. 2 towering Sari guards, their dark blue BL armor gleaming under the palace lights, flanked him as they led him down the vast hallways. The Sari were a powerful warrior race known for their strict traditions and battle-hardened culture. Paul had studied them before, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. The doors to the throne room slid open with a deep hum, revealing a massive chamber filled with nobles, warriors, and officials. At the far end sat Queen Sana, her golden crown Resting between her curved horns she was. Taller than any human, her sharp green eyes studying Paul with an intensity that made him uneasy. Paul took a deep breath and stepped forward. He had been sent here as a diplomat, but no one had told him why the silence in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Then the Queen's voice echoed through the hall. "You will satisfy my daughter, human." Paul froze. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. His heart pounded as he processed her words. What did she mean? He had heard that different species sometimes had strange translations, but this sounded wrong. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." The Queen's expression remained unreadable. "My daughter, Princess VY, lacks the strength expected of auxiliary warrior. She must learn from one who has the spirit of survival. The High Council believes a human may offer what she needs." Paul blinked. "You want me to train her?" The Queen nodded. "Teach her the ways of your kind. Show her what makes human special." Paul let out a slow breath. He had been expecting political discussions, trade agreements, maybe even peace talks, but now he was supposed to train an alien princess. A fig stepped forward from the side of the throne. Princess V. She was smaller than most Solari warriors, though still taller than Paul. Her deep purple skin shimmered under the throne room's golden lights. Her arms were crossed, and her piercing gaze showed clear skepticism. "This is a waste of time," she said, her voice sharp. "Humans are weak. What can he teach me?" Paul fought back a smirk. He had seen that kind of attitude before. Poe, prideful, stubborn, and full of doubt, but he wasn't about to back down. "I guess we'll find out," he said. The Queen's lips curled into what might have been a smile. "Then it is decided. The training begins tomorrow." Paul nodded, but inside he was already wondering what he had just gotten himself into. The training hall was quieter than Paul expected. The Solari were a warrior race, but today only Princess Vieri stood before him. She had her arms crossed, her usual look of skepticism still on her face. Paul adjusted his stance, trying to think of the best way to start. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Since we've already fought, let's talk about what you learned." V scoffed. "I learned that humans are fast, but they don't hit hard." Paul chuckled. "Not exactly. You saw how I avoided your attacks. That wasn't just Steve, it was strategy." VY frowned. "Strategy, eh? Real fight is about strength. The strongest warrior wins." Paul shook his head. "That's not always true. Humans don't survive because we're the strongest. We survive because we adapt, we think, and we use our enemies' weaknesses against them." VY narrowed her eyes. "So you fight with tricks?" Paul smirked. "I fight smart. Let me show you." He walked over to a training dummy made of heavy metal built to withstand the force of Siri warriors. "All right, hit this with everything you've got." VY didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and delivered a powerful punch. The force echoed through the hall, and the dummy shook slightly. She stepped back, looking satisfied. Paul nodded. "You're strong, but now watch this." Instead of punching the dummy, he stepped to the side and gave it a quick, precise push at a small joint near its base. The dummy wobbled, then suddenly tipped over, crashing onto the ground. V's eyes widened. "How did you?" Paul grinned. "I didn't use strength, I used leverage. Everything, even the strongest warrior, has a weak point. If you hit the right spot, you don't need strength." Very stared at the fallen dummy, then back at Paul. For the first time, there was a spark of curiosity in her expression. "So humans win by being clever?" she asked. Paul nodded. "Exactly. We're not the strongest, but we always find a way. That's what makes us dangerous." VY was silent for a moment, then she stepped forward. "Teach me." Paul smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere." Their training had officially begun. The training hall H was larger than any Paul had ever seen. High above, glowing orbs floated in the air, casting a golden light over the smooth metal floor. The walls were lined with weapons, long curved blades, heavy staffs, and strange alien devices Paul couldn't even begin to understand. Princess Vieri stood in the center of the hall, her arms crossed, as she watched Paul with her usual skeptical expression. "So what will you teach me today, human?" she asked. Paul smiled, tossing a small wooden stick into The air and catching it today, we're going to learn how to think like a warrior VRI. Raised an eyebrow I already. Think like a warrior, Paul, chuckled. You think like an Ailer warrior, but humans. We think differently. If you want to be stronger, you have to chain. How you see a fight. V's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't AR you. That was already progress. Paul walked over to a large training dummy in the shape of a Sillery soldier. All right, imagine you're in battle. Your opponent is bigger than you, stronger than you. How do you win? Vi stepped forward without hesitation. I hit them harder. I attack first. Paul shook his head. That works against weaker enemies. But what if they're stronger than you? What if they expect your attack? VY frowned. Then I fight until I win. Paul smiled. That's the auxiliary way, but let me show you something else. He picked up a handful of small training balls from a nearby table. They were light, made of some soft material. He handed one to VY. Try to hit me with this, he said. Vi scoffed. This is a game for children. Paul shrugged. Maybe, but humor me. V sighed and threw the ball. She was fast, but Paul dodged easily. She threw another. He ducked another. He sidestepped. After a few more, she growled in frustration. You're just running away. Paul grinned. No, I'm making you tired. You're using all your energy trying to hit me, and I haven't even attacked yet. VY paused her, breathing slightly heavier. That's a trick. Paul nodded. It's a strategy. A fight isn't just about who is stronger. It's about control. The best warrior doesn't just attack. They wait. They make their enemy waste energy. They look for weaknesses, and when the moment is right. Before Viry could react, Paul flicked his wrist, sending one of the training balls flying. It hit her shoulder with a soft tap. She blinked in surprise. They strike. PA. Paul finished with a smirk. Gary stared at him for a long moment. Then instead of getting angry, she smiled. I see, she said. You fight with patience. Paul nodded. Exactly. You don't always have to be the strongest. You just have to be the smartest. VY looked down at the training ball in her hand, her fingers tightening around it for the first time. Paul saw something different in her expression. Understanding. Teach me more, she said. Paul smiled. That's what I'm here for. Their real training had just begun. The training had continued for days, and Paul could see the change in VY. She was no longer just relying on her strength. She was thinking, observing, and using strategy in fights. She still had her Jillery pride, but now she was willing to listen to learn. Paul stood in the training hall watching his very sparred with another Hilary warrior. This time she wasn't just attacking wildly. She was patient, waiting for the right moment. When her opponent swung too hard, she stepped aside, using their own force against them. Within seconds, she had them on the ground, victorious. The watching warriors murmured among themselves. They had never seen VY fight like this before. Some seemed impressed, others skeptical. Paul noticed one figure, standing apart from the rest. Commander Rallick. He was a high-ranking Sari warrior, taller and broader than most, with deep scars across his arms. His golden eyes were locked onto Paul, filled with quiet disdain. Paul had seen that look before. Rallick didn't like humans. As the warriors dispersed, Rallick approached, his steps heavy against the metal floor. You have changed the princess's way of fighting, Rallick said, his voice deep and slow. Paul met his gaze calmly. She's learning to think differently. That's a good thing. Rick crossed his arms. Solari warriors do not need tricks. We fight with strength and honor. Paul smirked. And if strength isn't enough, Rick's eyes narrowed. It is all enough. Paul could tell arguing wouldn't change anything. Some warriors refused to see things differently, but Rallick wasn't just another warrior. He was respected, powerful, and dangerous. Rallick took a step closer. I have heard the Queen favors you. She believes humans can teach us. His voice dropped lower. But I do not. Paul sighed. I'm not here to prove anything to you, Commander. I'm here to train the princess. Arvik smirked. Then you will not refuse a challenge. Paul frowned. What kind of challenge? Arvik stepped back, raising his voice so the others could hear. A duel, you and I, in the arena. If you win, I will accept that humans have something to teach us. A murmur spread through the watching warriors. Some seemed excited, others looked uncertain. Paul wasn't sure what to say. He knew Arvik didn't respect him, but this challenge wasn't just about that. This was about proving whether a human truly Belonged here before he could answer a voice cut through the hall. I accept Paul. Turned in surprise, V had stepped forward, her expression cold. If you challenge my teacher, you challenge me, Arvik chuckled. I challenge the human, not you, Princess V's eyes burned with determination. Then you challenge both of us. The room fell silent. Even Arvik seemed surprised. Paul sighed. Well, this just got complicated. The Queen's voice suddenly echoed from the entrance of the hall. Then it is decided, she said, her presence commanding the attention of all. Tomorrow the duel will take place in the grand arena. Arvik smirked. I will see you both there. As he walked away, Paul turned to Vieri. You didn't have to do that. Vi crossed her arms. Yes, I did. Paul exhaled, shaking his head. Then we better be ready. Tomorrow they would fight, and losing was not an option. The grand arena was filled with the sound of drums and the low murmurs of the gathered Solari warriors. The massive structure, built from ancient stone and metal, had hosted countless battles. Today it would witness something never seen before: a human and a princess standing together against one of the strongest warriors in the Empire. Paul stood beside Vieri, rolling his shoulders and stretching his arms. The heat of the twin suns beat down on the sand beneath his boots. He glanced at Vi, who stood tall, her purple skin shimmering under the light. Her expression was calm, focused. Are you ready for this? Paul asked. Verse smirked. I was born ready. The real question is, are you? Paul chuckled. Honestly, not really, but that never stopped me before. Across the arena, Commander Rallick stood like an immovable mountain. His battle armor gleamed, and his sharp golden eyes were locked onto them. His confidence was clear. He didn't believe for a second that they could win. Queen Xian stood on a raised platform, her presence alone enough to silence the crowd. She raised her hand, signaling the start of the duel. Begin. The moment the word left her lips, Rallick moved. He was fast, much faster than Paul expected. In a single bound, he was already in front of them, swinging his heavy staff in a wide arc. Paul barely had time to react as V leaped forward, meeting the attack with her own weapon. Their weapons clashed with a loud clang. Closer, placing a hand on V's shoulder. I trust you, my daughter, and I trust you, Paul. Do not let me be wrong. A growing storm as Paul and Vieri left the Queen's chambers. Paul couldn't help but shake his head. Why does it feel like every time we win something, another problem shows up? Vieri smirked. That is life. Paul sighed. Yeah, so what's our plan? V's expression grew serious. We start by watching Arvik. If he truly does not support this rebellion, we may be able to use him to stop it. Paul nodded. And if he does support it? V's gaze hardened. Then we fight. Paul exhaled, stretching his arms. Guess I should start training extra hard. Then Vi chuckled. I will not go easy on you. Paul grinned. Wouldn't want you to. As they walked toward the training grounds, both of them knew that a storm was coming, and this time the fight would not be in the arena. It would be in the shadows against enemies they could not yet see, but they would be ready. The tension in the palace was heavy. Paul and Vieri had spent days watching, waiting, trying to uncover the truth behind the rebellion. Now, they didn't have to wait any longer. A royal guard had rushed into the training hall just moments ago, his face pale with urgency. Rallick is missing, he had said, and the rebel warriors are gathering outside the city walls. Paul tightened his fists. This was it. Queen Sana had called for an emergency meeting in the war chamber. Paul and V entered to find the Queen standing before a massive holographic map of the city, surrounded by high-ranking warriors and strategists. They are moving fast. One advisor reported a group of at least 50 warriors, fully armed. Their goal is clear. They want to challenge your rule. The Queen's expression was unreadable. And Arvik, we still do not know where he stands, the guard admitted. Paul crossed his arms. Then we assume the worst. If he's not with us, he's against us. Vi clenched her jaw. I need to stop this before it turns into war. The Queen turned to her daughter. What do you intend to do? V straightened. I will go to them. I will speak with them. Paul frowned. That's dangerous. If they see you as the enemy, they won't listen. Vieri shook her head. I have to try. The Queen studied her for a moment before nodding. Then go, but be prepared. Paul sighed. Guess that means On going with you very smirked, of course, the face off the sun was setting as Paul and V arrived at the edge of the city. The rebel warriors stood in formation, their weapons gleaming under. The red sky in front of them stood Rallick. Paul exhaled, well, that answers that question. Very stepped forward, Rallick, her voice carried through the open space. What are you doing? Arvik's golden eyes locked onto hers. What must be done? Paul shook his head. You shook my hand. After to the duel, you said you accepted that. Humans had something to teach. Was that a lie? Rick's expression remained cold. Not lie, but accepting you is not the same as accepting change. Our traditions have lasted for generations. I will not let them be rewritten so easily. V's voice was firm. Change is not weakness. Arvik's grip tightened on his weapon. You sound like your mother. VY took another step forward. Because she is right. The rebels behind Arvik murmured, uncertain. Some looked at each other, doubt creeping in Rick's eyes flickered. As he noticed this, his voice hardened enough. Talk. If you believe in this new path, then fight for it. He raised his weapon. A final duel. You against me, Princess Fi. If you win, I will order my warriors to stand down. Paul opened his mouth to argue, but Very held up a hand. She stepped forward. Eyes locked on Rallick. I accept the last duel. The battle was fierce. Arvik was stronger, but Very was faster. She didn't just rely on power. She used every lesson she had learned. Paul watched, his heart pounding. V wasn't just fighting with strength. She was thinking, adapting, using everything they had trained for. Rallick attacked with a powerful strike, but Very Seed stepped smoothly, countering with a quick strike to his ribs. The impact forced him back, and for the first time, Arvik looked uncertain. Paul smirked. She's got him. Arvik growled and lunged, but Very twisted out of reach, using his own momentum against him with one final move. She knocked him to the ground, placing her weapon at his throat. Silence filled the air. V's voice was steady. Yield. Arvik stared up at her, breathing hard. Then slowly he dropped his weapon. I yield. A new beginning. The rebel warriors hesitated, then one by one they lowered their weapons. Vieri stepped back, offering Rallick a hand. After a moment he took it and stood. You have changed, Princess, he admitted, and perhaps so must I. V nodded. We all must. Paul exhaled in relief. That was stressful. Ver smirked. You doubted me. Paul grinned. Never. As they returned to the palace, the future of the Siluri Empire was forever changed. The battle was over, and a new era had begun.